there. Almost got to open my windows today, but my wife can hear me if I leave the windows open, so back to the air conditioner.
Is
But
that one of the rules that you can do whatever you want, but she's not allowed to hear you?
well, it's I mean she's working next door, and then it's like, oh, I heard you talking the whole time, and it's like, oh, that's kind of annoying. Not that wonderful to be overheard, I guess, even if she
We're
probably can't make
we're
out
covering
specific
important
words.
stuff here, though, man.
I know, really. Hold on, let me bring up my notes for this one. But yeah, what do I do? I had my summer school, had to stay in your room because of COVID thing, where I was maybe sick for one day.
COVID sick or just some other kind of sick?
It was COVID, I guess, but I got over it in like 12 hours, right? But then they're like, stay in your room for a week.
Yeah. Well, I mean, every cold is really COVID, right? It's just COVID-19, and then there's like a million variants. They're going to be here forever now.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had a nasty headache that I wouldn't want to wish on anyone for a few hours, but that was about the long and short of it.
Hmm.
So, okay, I guess we'll plunge on into this one as I will eventually need to run off. But yeah, I have my normal amount of time, nothing too weird. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and I saw your notes, so you can. It's interesting for me to be like the straight man in these with you coming with all the snark and stuff. So I like the dynamic, but it's one that I very not very frequently get to be the straight man in any conversation.
Okay, I'll be the nutball. That's cool.
Yeah.
Hey, this is the Occult Disney series of podcast where we take a look under the hood and look for magical secret elements of the classic Disney movies. This is Matt Comges here. As usual, joining us is Thomas Gorence, the paranoid American. Hello.
That's me. Hello. And
That's
I'm excited
you.
about this one. We are gonna have some cool sort of hidden symbolism brought to the forefront, hopefully.
Yeah. Actually, though, watching it, you know, I guess this one is like we think of this one as like, oh, the magical Disney movie. It's got the fairy godmother and stuff. I'm like, the that magic is basically like window dressing. I mean, there's other stuff going on, I think, but that particular flavor is just kind of like, yeah, that is just twinkly stars and a few interesting animations for the most part.
I do agree with you. There was one, like, jumping right into that magic aspect of this. There was one thing that stood out, and that's that one of the basic premises of magic is that you tend to have to give up something from yourself in exchange for the thing that you're receiving. And in this particular instance of Cinderella, it does feel like it's like window dressing or cheating, or like they skipped over the part of like, what does Cinderella have to give up? She just kind of just gets all of the benefits, and there's no real sacrifice from its most apparent. Just watching it, it just seems like it's just all receiving, like, great for her, but it
Although
misses out on some of that balance in the dynamic, I think.
Although she has been living a relatively crap life for however many years we are at this point. We were not quite sure how long it's been since dad died.
Yeah, maybe, or mom, because it's a stepmother, right?
Right, right. I think it was mom died, then the dad remarried, then dad died, and now she's just living in her tower, which, let's be fair, the tower has a fantastic view. And there's
I
plenty
I
of
made that same note. Like, there have been people that had to go through far worse with a much worse view than what she goes through. So
like, if she had like a castle wall as her view out of the window, you'd feel more. And also I was like, man, there are some hipsters that would like pay top rent for that place now.
and speaking of magic too, this one's interesting because she can inexplicably talk with animals, which was one of the themes in a previous one. But this one also, it's like some of the animals, even us as the viewers, can understand. Other ones we can. They'll just, cheep, 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 cheep. And she's like, oh, what's that? Timmy's done a well. Like, she can understand exactly what the animals are saying to her, which in, what was it, Snow White, that I think in Snow White, it kind of represented a little bit more direct of this feminine energy being able to communicate with nature. And Cinderella, again, it's almost like window dressing a little bit. It's a little bit more superficial. Like, she can just talk to animals because it gives a much easier reason to go into song, and it also presents a few sidekicks and other kind of like secondary characters to like help Cinderella that don't really exist outside of the animal kingdom.
Well, apparently they were just like really doubling down on this has to have like a cat and mouse aspect, like going back like a decade before they actually made this thing. That was kind of a core tenet. Like we have to Tom and Jerry this a bit for some reason. That said, I don't know. I like obviously the animation's better here, but I do kind of prefer Tom and Jerry for that sort of hijink.
Yeah, it doesn't come across very well, although an inordinate amount of this movie, which I didn't remember being pretty much all involved with that cat and mouse aspect, but it's weird, like the Cinderella story kind of comes and goes, but the real story that you're constantly following is this cat interacting with the mice and just or other like non-Cinderella-esque things happening. And I also absolutely forgot that the cat's name is Lucifer, which was awesome. It made me more interested as it went.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I was like, whoa, isn't that like kind of on the nose even for 1950? I don't know. Did 1950s have more of a like Satan and Lightbringer distinction, or is it just the
Honestly, man,
cat's
the
evil?
the Luciferianism goes back to the early 20th century, like 1920s, around there. The concept of Lucifer and Luciferianism and worshiping Lucifer was not that far removed from even the upper echelons of society, like high society. So it was almost like a cool party thing. Like, oh, have you heard that Matthew is a Luciferian? Oh, let's go over to his table and talk to him.
Yeah, I was just wondering for the Joe Schmo buying a ticket in 1950, what they would take, or is like at this point you'd have like the Christian right screaming about it. You can't put name a cat Lucifer in a kids movie or something, right? But in 1950,
Maybe I don't know if they would have
okay.
latched onto the name as much. Like Chernobog would have been just as offensive, right?
Yeah, true, but I mean that's one that even now would people just be like, what? What's that?
And
um,
a cool thing to point out for almost every villain that follows after Fantasia and Chernobog is that a lot of the Disney villain characters tend to have not necessarily horns, but the silhouette of their head implies two horns. And this actually kind of starts with the evil stepmother in this movie. If you look at a silhouette of her head, she's got her hair kind of up in these two buns. But if you look at like a silhouette of Chernobog and a silhouette of almost every other Disney villain, they tend to follow. It's very similar silhouette, which I think is really a cool kind of Easter egg.
yeah, and I'm like we're like, oh, horns, that's kind of evil, but if you go far enough back, horns and halos tend to get kind of mixed up. Like you find a bunch of images of Moses with horns, which is supposed to actually suggest some kind of divinity as opposed to being evil. If you've seen sort of old paintings, I think like 13th, 14th century will show Moses like in sculpture thing where he's got like a little pair of horns on him. So which I
Yeah,
don't.
dude knows how to party, man.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, party
If
at
you ever
Mount
come
Sinai.
across someone with a pair of horns, you know they know how to party.
We have to check the horns. Like, do you mind to make sure it's not
Yeah.
just a application of some
You in
kind?
the back bird in that bush again. Get out of here.
Usually by this point, I've been like, hey, do a quick plot synopsis, but I feel like this is a case where basically the name of the movie is like the plot synopsis. Like, just everybody knows it already.
Yeah, and actually that's a really good point to start this on because Cinderella is a little bit unique from all the other Disney movies so far and the ones to follow in that it didn't necessarily come directly from Brothers Grimm. Cinderella predates Brothers Grimm by at least 100 years, but more likely it predates it even farther back than that because Cinderella is also unique in that it's a story that many different cultures have adapted to their own. Like it's not always the same name, it's not always the same exact accessory, but the exact same plot line plays out across many different cultures. So this is something that's kind of like deeper in the archetype that almost everyone has heard some version of. Although you could almost make an argument that at this point in modern day, most people's version of Cinderella is the Disney version of Cinderella, and they probably haven't come across it in a lot of other places. But it does predate Brothers Grimm quite a bit, and even the guy that I think that the Disney version adapted after was Charles Perrault, and even his version was just kind of like an amalgamation, edited retelling of, previous fairy tales that came before his time.
Well, just most people in the West would the flood story would go directly for the Noah version, but that's also one of just many, many, many. So with
Yep,
different
yeah. Pretty
names
much
and
all the
fill ins for
antediluvian, mythology all kind of shares all the same beats. It's a great analogy here to like Cinderella almost.
because like Gilgamesh has a much trippier version of the flood story. If you want to get into that one, that's way more fun, I think. That movie a few years ago did a pretty wild version of it, though. Yeah.
There's
Uh,
also a really cool movie called Noah that was based off of a comic book, and I think that one was directed by Darren Aronofsky, who
yeah,
did
yeah, that's what I'm getting
Pi,
at.
and
So
I
it's
love that. That one is such a cool aspect of it.
yeah, it's not a fun watch, but it's definitely a fascinating watch because everyone in that movie is just so pissed off all the time. They're all drinking Russell Crowe juice or something. I just remember
and
that scene.
also talking about this, the origins of the Disney one, at least it was this guy Charles Perrault, and Charles Perrault is interesting because he's essentially one of the writers, or the writer of Tales of Mother Goose, which very much like Brothers Grimm, represented a bunch of folk tales that were spread out through many different countries, and this guy kind of compiled them all together into a really popular book. Almost everyone's probably heard of Tales of Mother Goose. So here's the guy that actually compiled that original version of it, and he had, I think, like 7 brothers and sisters, which don't even get. It's funny because they did some really impressive things in life, but he kind of overshadows them. If you go to any of his siblings' pages, it's always like the leading thing is, oh, they were related to the guy that wrote Mother Goose, but one of them basically invented the whole entire field of hydrology, which is the study of water as it moves across Earth and goes, into the land and up into the sky and stuff. And another one basically did all the architecture for the east facade of the Louvre, and they designed the Paris Observatory. So like he came from good stock, like everyone in his family was doing something pretty substantial that has lasted the test of time. But Charles happens to be the most famous through his Mother Goose stuff.
It's kind of like how Michael Nesmith is famous because of the monkeys, but his mom created like Whiteout or something. Seems bigger in the monkeys. But either Hedy Lamarr. I missed. I was trying to remember who it was, and she's best known as an actress, but also did like code breaking work and things like that, like
Oh
wild.
yeah, and she's credited for some of the concepts of frequency band hopping, which we still use in Wi-Fi and almost all wireless technologies. She's got like a bunch of patents, I believe. Also, her husband was like a European gun smuggler. Like her story is fascinating too, man.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Mel Brooks did her a disservice because when I hear her name, the first images I get is what's his name in Blazing Saddles?
Oh yeah.
It's Headley. So yeah, I can't picture. Actually, I can picture her too, but yeah.
Wasn't it
um,
like Zsa Zsa Gabor or something?
I mean, the '30s starlet look, right? I guess she was a little in the '40s too, but um, so I'm thinking the real magic in this movie is more like kind of like law of attraction stuff. That definitely is baked into the pie a bit with
Absolutely. If you had to pick one magical mechanism, I'd say that's the most prevalent one here out of all of them. And we'll get into some of the actual symbolism that will show how right you are, I think.
now if we go by her room, I guess it's working, although in the macro of her life it doesn't seem to be working very well. Maybe she's learning the ropes of it. That's where you say, like, yeah, she didn't have to give something, she didn't have to sacrifice, but she does have to live like this somewhat submissive crappy life for however long.
Well, and also in the various books versus the cartoon, there's, subtle differences. One of those differences is the fairy godmother herself. So in the movie, the fairy godmother is sort of the active magician. She's the one that's doing all the magic, and it's just Cinderella that might be just making wishes. But it's, and that, I guess you could say those are magical incantations or spells, and the fairy godmother represents the magic. In some of the tellings of the book and in some poems of the story, this happens under a tree, and the tree, if you're sitting down under it and leaned back against it, can sort of represent like Kundalini, essentially, and sort of energy rising throughout the limbs, meaning going to all your extremities. And this also goes into the fact that in the story, she starts out with wooden shoes, which then transform into crystal slippers, which then in some versions finally end up as golden slippers after she gets with the prince. So this also is this transformation from the organic, wood base material into this transmutation of a clear, crystalline structure, and then finally gold, which is kind of retelling an alchemical process of transformation as well.
Yeah, yeah. Glass seems to be selling it short in this movie. Um, something that did come up in the development of this movie, at least according to what I was reading before it came on, apparently there was quite a bit of animators or writers who did want to give Cinderella a bit more of a backbone, make her a bit more rebellious, and I think they probably had a point. And she
Yeah,
just
I
doesn't
mean,
seem that
she's
much
definitely
spark.
just she very much represents like a coat hanger, right? Like her going to the ball and her wearing this beautiful gown and these slippers that everyone notices is very much the epitome of fashion design, where the model is not meant to be looked at or even acknowledged, and they're essentially just a fancy coat hanger for this beautiful gown and accessories, and that's what everyone is obsessed about. I mean, even the prince himself, he falls in love with this girl, but he has no idea what she looks like. He just knows about her, fashion sense and her shoes, which kind of reduces Cinderella to, again, just like almost a coat hanger. Like you can just swap her out with any of her stepsisters, essentially.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, and then of course that's not enough. It's like what I once dated a girl who liked all the same bands I did, and it got really boring really quickly. So,
Well, and that's another good point here, is that it says they live happily ever after, but really we only see the prince and Cinderella like crystallized in time after their first date, at the height of, their attraction and allure to each other. I wonder if there's ever been like an interesting follow-up of like, and here's 20 years later and they're just like arguing over something, and because this is essentially a relationship built entirely on, first appearances and one initial interaction, and then it's just like, and they lived happily ever after. Like, well, that's leaving out like the other 20, 30, 40 years of their life. How exactly did they get together? How did they get along?
yeah, I was like, oh, this would have been a good early place to put some post-credit sequences as we see them rip into each other. Now there are some direct-to-video sequels from like 2002 and something after that, but I don't even know if we need to like consider those, except just mentioning they exist. So I guess somebody
A little
decided
bit
to
of
take
cash
the
grabs, a little bit of like, oh,
oh,
you've already
total.
owned Cinderella 1, why not own Cinderella 2, 3, 4, and 5?
Well, I got one of my regular co-hosts who will preach the virtues of the Little Mermaid 3. So
Well, yeah, but isn't that the one that gets into the Titanic, or no?
I don't know. I've only seen the first one. I'm saying he's preaching the virtues. I have not seen it, so he's the same guy who tells me Frozen 2 is basically an X-Men film, which does make me interested in watching it, but I still haven't. So
Once you get really deep into the sequels and trilogies, especially the direct to video, they realize that only a small niche of hardcore people are watching these, or it, like, they don't have to boil the ocean and cater to every single person out there. So you find some really weird, wild experiments in those direct to video sequels sometimes, like stuff that never would have floated by for the initial headliner when they knew that they had to slot it for movies and get Happy Meal toys based on it. But then it's all of a sudden it like turns into the Wiz, after like sequel 2, 3, or 4. It's just like, oh, they're just gonna make stuff up now. That's fine.
I don't think they've gotten to too many fours. No, is it 4 or 5 where we go into space? Cinderella in space or the Little Mermaid in space. It's got to be the space sequel somewhere down the line. But
And I had a note here too, for the actual animation. This featured one of my favorite Disney artists' names, which is Thor Putnam. And if you look into Thor, who was involved in this one, he was the art director for Pinocchio, and he was also the art director for the Night on Bald Mountain slash Ave Maria feature that was part of Fantasia. So that same guy that brought those two together was here at the helm again on Cinderella. And an interesting one is that right after I think he finished doing Fantasia, he immediately joined the Navy in 42, and he did a stint in the Navy. And as soon as he got out of the Navy, I think 4 or 5 years later, he returned directly to Walt Disney and started working on Cinderella. So that's just kind of badass, like a Disney animator, like, oh, all right, guys, I'll see you in 4 years after I join the war and fight some Germans, and I'll see you back here to work on the next big picture. But that's kind of like a weird dynamic here.
Is he one of our 9 old men? Because I know this is about the time that definitely like the nine. I mean, they're all in their 30s apparently still, but they were the
That's a
ones
good
that have been
question. I
around
mean,
a while.
Thor was one of the OGs. I don't know if he was part of the nine.
I'm having a look if
And I also had a note here that maybe I was just being overly critical for some reason on this particular viewing, but the animation itself and the artwork falls a little bit flat in this one, even when you compare it to Dumbo and Snow White and some of the other ones that we've seen already. Specifically, there's not a lot of shading either behind the characters or even as they like walk into the light or to show any kind of depth. I think Bambi also had a similar, very flat look to it in comparison, but this one, again, it lacks a little bit of soul. Like, even the rotoscoping looks good and Cinderella looks good, but they lack any real depth throughout the entire movie, and it maintains this cartoony fantasy feel that stays a little bit detached, though. I don't know. Again, that might be a little bit overly critical of a movie from 1950, but it stood out to me.
well, Pinocchio, Snow White, and Fantasia had all those like painted backgrounds, which I'm sure were,
Well,
you
and this
know,
one has painted backgrounds, but honestly, it makes it all the more stark, the contrast between that flat foreground and that kind of deeper background.
apparently some of the animators did kind of complain about the rotoscoping on this one. They felt like, since they had to stick to that, they had constraints that they didn't want for this one, which might be part of it. So it's a,
And
what
you
was
you
it?
could almost see the anatomy of the rotoscoping a little bit more in this one too. It might not be easy for everyone to pick out that hasn't looked at like a million rotoscopes before, but there's this distinct quality of the face being slightly detached from the body and the hair being slightly detached from the face, and it's almost like all the different elements of the body are animated independently and then put back together, so there's a little bit this of lack of cohesion for the whole, because that's exactly how rotoscoping works. Is It's not always you outlining the entire body frame to frame. It's like, I'm going to outline just the face and just the arm and then just the leg, and you kind of like start putting those elements together, and you can sort of see those building blocks and like where the seams lie when you watch this one.
And just to throw out, Thor is not one of our 9 old men. I got the list here, so just if anyone cares, it's
Poor Thor.
Les Clark, Mark Davis, Ollie Johnson, Mitt Call, Ward Kimball, Eric Larson, John Lounsbury, Frank Thomas, Wolfgang Reitherman. He's got a good name.
He does. Maybe it's because Thor was an art director and not one of the direct illustrators. I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is the animation board basically.
Okay,
So
that's
it's
probably
like
what it was then.
the Supreme Court of Disney, basically. if they need that sort of thing.
Is
Um,
where your drawings go to die.
exactly. I was thinking we talked about Snow White where she's almost frightened because her manifestation worked out so quickly. You could kind of look at this as like a more slow moving one. It's basically the same thing happens, just now it takes 45 minutes. I made a note that nothing really happens until halfway through this movie, but
Yeah. And this is another one of those movies too where it's like, man, like it takes forever to build up, and then all of a sudden you're at the ending and you already know what happens if you've seen the movie once, where the prince comes and they all try on the shoe. But man, that feels like shoehorned in at the very end, pun intended. But like, bam, it's like all of a sudden, oh, there's 15 minutes left in the movie. I hope they start wrapping this up pretty quickly. And then it's just like bam, bam, bam. Yeah, they wrap it up real quick.
so I by this point I will say at least they're padding. Well, that's basically the cat and mouse stuff, I guess, for the most part. So it didn't
If you
feel
take
quite.
that out, this is like a half-hour movie, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it did feel like at least integrated a little better because I know in Snow White, I said some of the segments actually stood out, like, oh, they're trying to make this feature length, and I think Bambi we had that feeling a bit too. So, as
Bambi big time. This one I feel like they do a much better job of weaving the songs in. Like it's not just all of a sudden they just burst in the song. You can kind of see like a story or something will happen and then she'll start talking about it and then she'll like her talking will become a little bit more melodic and then all of a sudden like birds come in and music starts to come in and it like blends in. So then you're like, okay, yeah, we're about to go into a song versus some of the other ones where it's like talking, okay, song, okay, now back to talking. So I think this one they do a really good job of, if you're like a really good DJ, you know how to like blend two songs together, so it almost sounded like one song. I think Cinderella has some aspect of that. There was much more care put into this than Bambi for sure.
there was a sketch comedy about 20 years ago, the Upright Citizens Brigade, where they have
Oh yeah,
I'm talking about the guy comes in to
this is where
pitch
Amy Poehler
songs.
came from. I think was Upright Citizens Brigade.
That's right. Yeah, that's the comedy troupe I took drinking once. As in university, and I was supposed to
This is Chicago, right? I think they're in a few cities, but isn't their main one Chicago?
for Upright Citizens. This was actually
Yeah,
University of Georgia. They were doing a show there, so my
interesting.
my job was to ferry them from the hotel to the show, take some photos of the show, take them back, and they wanted me to take them to a bar on the way back. So took them to my favorite
Huh.
bar. Took the comedy troupe drinking. That was always fun. But yeah, they got the Mogi Pie sketch where the guy's pitching Disney, and he's like Mogi Pie. It's like you just made that up. It's like, it took me 6 months to write that. So I guess they just had Zippity Doodah and Song of the South, and here we got our Bippity
Bippity
Boppity Boo.
boppity
So,
boos. Yeah.
but yeah, it is kind of like like you're mentioning, like the incantations or whatever.
And these ones are much more earwigs too, or earworms. I mean, that like these ones are catchy. And I guess the two main ones I would say is a dream is a wish your heart makes and bippity boppity boo. And they're both just in terms of lyricism and just the songs themselves are great. I mean, they're better than anything that Bambi has to offer. I'm just gonna keep shitting on Bambi here in comparison, but yeah, I think they're just so much better in every single conceivable way versus some of the other previous movies.
Yeah, I mean the main thing I guess holding this movie back a little bit is simply that our main characters and our main character and the prince are like such absolute ciphers. So, you
Yeah,
know,
it's a Ken doll and a Barbie doll. I mean, it's there's they have the not a lot more personality. There's not a lot more like the ultimate conflict is that she gets locked in this room and she's not being treated very well by her, stepmother. And again, if you read the non-Disney versions that Disney is based on, it gets a little bit more cruel than that, but not necessarily. It's not the same level as some of the other tragedies that Disney heroes have to go through.
I mean, what happens if David Bowie's Goblin King shows up? The prince is running off with him. That's the way I see it, at least. What was that? It was I was seeing a meme that's like a day or two ago. It's like, oh, like your sexuality or whatever. It doesn't matter what they teach you in kindergarten. It matters how you respond to Labyrinth and David Bowie when
Yeah.
you're a child. So yeah, that sounds about right. So, oh man, the one dude, the king, the duke or whatever, he's given the chance to like make his own title and flubs it.
I mean, isn't that just kind of like the most natural story ever? That actually I think I relate to the most.
Yeah, I'm just like he let that pass him by. He's like, oh, where is she? What, you want that to be your title? I want to be like what, the man who would be king of the popes or something. That'd be great.
Again, that was just a little bit deeper than they had in mind for this particular movie.
Yeah, it was just when I was watching, it's like, oh, he really missed that. The king is definitely trying to push his son into doing it as hard as he can. I
Yeah,
just
it comes across as like he thinks his son's like a loser, and I guess this is the version of like go get a job, but it's just like go marry a princess, son.
Yeah, this is where I guess I got the snarkiest with my notes with the the king just wants to watch his kid bang, just like Steven Tyler and Armageddon. Which we just did that on our podcast. Man, it's creepy. Dad's like singing about her getting on with Ben Affleck. That's weird. The sisters' names are weird because I feel like Anastasia is a perfectly. I mean, well, it's got the whole like czarist, like Russian Revolution stuff behind it, but it's a decent enough name. And then the other one's like Drizella. That's a terrible name. What's up with that?
When and in the movie, they kind of make them look a little bit goofy. They give them like big noses to portray them as not being very, pretty compared to Cinderella. But in the stories, they're basically as attractive as Cinderella is, and the only thing that can tell them apart is that glass slipper. So I thought that was an interesting thing where it makes sense. Obviously the aesthetically, you want to make the villains look different than the leading character, and then making them look a little bit uglier and goofier kind of just
Large
helps that
footed.
cartoony. Yeah, exactly. But I think that was an interesting element that got lost in the translation between story to movie.
Well, also just the how twisted are you on the inside, right? The idea is they're relatively, maybe their beauty is skin deep, but then they're kind of nasty under the surface is the idea. Although then here we got Cinderella, who's like nothing under the surface. So
Yeah, it's just like cardboard and vanilla flavored cardboard behind there. And you mentioned the names Cinderella. I found one interesting interpretation, that not in the Perot version, but in another old version of Cinderella, they mentioned that her name was Ella, just normally, but it got transformed into Cinderella because she was always covered in ash and soot from her, her menial day-to-day work inside this, this horrible tower. Hence, the name Cinderella. So it's like Ella covered in ash and soot.
that makes sense. No, when I started the movie last night and it just came up on the screen, I'm thinking, oh, Cinder. Okay, I guess that. I mean, that makes sense. It's a relatively obvious cruel joke to make towards someone, I suppose.
And I had some other kind of higher level observations on this one. The main one being that if you were to retell this story and you didn't call it Cinderella and you just loosely adopted it to like a modern theme and took a lot of the magic out, this is a story about a woman catfishing a CEO. This is someone that goes and presents themselves as something they're definitely not, and they're specifically targeting a high profile, high worth individual so that they can like latch on and get that money. I mean, this is Cinderella essentially. If you were to reshoot this in 2022 as a live action, she's just a gold digger. This could be an episode of The Con with Whoopi Goldberg narrating about, how this poor prince got swindled by this, this gypsy girl or something.
Yeah, well, it's like what's in a name, because well, I talk a lot of sci-fi films, and we're like, would the would the kind of recent Total Recall and RoboCop films be better if they simply weren't called that? Just give them
Yeah,
a
yeah,
different
just let
name,
them stand on their own. Yeah.
like RoboCop, just call it Drone, and then now we don't have to associate it with the older movie, which Verhoeven movies didn't really have big problems, so it's like you don't have to remake them, but you can do something new, sure, or other movies where you're like, this could feels a little bit like an old franchise. Like calling The Rock a James Bond movie. That's always a fun one to do. Works for me at least. Then you have to deal with the fact that James Bond's been languishing in Alcatraz for 30 years. But whatever, I can do that.
Well, and you've got the inverse of that too, where people will make a movie and then after it's been shot and edited, someone will be like, "Hey, we should call this American Psycho 2 or something." And nobody involved in the actual production of the movie ever thought it was going to be called the sequel to something. That is true. I think American Psycho 2 was originally shot as an entire, its own thing. And then when they went to release it, they were like, "Man, this is gonna flop unless we do something." So they just kind of slapped that title on there, hoping that anyone that saw American Psycho 1 would be interested. And sure enough, people were like, "What the hell is this? This has nothing to do with American Psycho."
It's like the mockbusters, like, hey, maybe all the Transformers have been like rented. So here's Transmorphers. So I guess it
They're just
doesn't.
banking on someone that forgot the name of the movie between the time they saw it and the time they go to rent it.
Or they were in a rush and they just didn't read the box properly. So I
They,
do
they go home
plan.
with snakes on a train. They didn't realize that it was snakes on a plane.
I've heard Snakes on a Train includes like voodoo and stuff, so could be good. I
Yeah,
actually,
yeah, that's usually an Asylum move. I think Asylum Pictures usually
oh
is the
yeah,
ones that do that,
yeah,
like
that's their bread and butter. Now again for the sci-fi one, that's kind of been on my mind to do like a mockbuster month, and actually like watch like four of these over a month and do those. I mean, again, Cinderella, you can use the name because it's nobody owns it, right? So there's all those super low rent, $5 budget versions of Cinderella you can get at the supermarket.
oh, there's no shortage of different Cinderella movies out there. If you, filter out the Disney version, there's all kinds of, dating back to the early 1900s even.
Yeah, yeah, it's one of the first stories that was filmed, and you can go for another Disney version now. Like, that's been part of their live action run, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
Which I not. I mean, what did I see? I saw the Jungle Book. I saw Maleficent, and then I kind of like, why am I watching these? The Lion King is just like, why did they even make that? It's just
Yeah,
animated
man, I'm
again.
I'm with you on that. It's like, why make an inferior version of something that everyone already loves? I mean, you're not going to catch lightning in a bottle twice, essentially. I mean, we're on a little bit of a tangent here, but man, the Cruella movie is a great example of something that, what in my opinion, was a successful adaptation because they didn't just remake 101 Dalmatians. They kind of like took a completely different approach, showed a different backstory, and did it in live action in a way that made it its own thing that was, worth watching, and not just a retelling where every single story beat before it happens.
Like in terms of Cinderella, again, I didn't watch the live action remake, but I assume they just had to add a bunch of like B plot or something. Maybe do they have more cats? I don't know.
I've seen it, although I decidedly just didn't watch any of the remakes. I just watched the classic one as I was coming up with my notes here, because this is another one of those movies that, as a 40-year-old single, not single, but a 40-year-old man without children, like I don't have any reason in the world to ever pop on the Disney adaptation of Cinderella and watch it through its entirety from beginning to end. Like it just never would come up in like the things that would happen in a normal day for me. So it was interesting sitting down and actually watching this thing and taking notes.
Yeah, I was noting though, like I got these pink Blu-ray cases, right? And I did note Cinderella was in the secondary case, meaning when my daughter was very young, we did not watch Cinderella as much.
It sounds like there's some good taste that runs in your family.
Right, right. So the A game one has Dumbo and Pinocchio and Snow White, but I had to go to the secondary case for Cinderella. So I think Bambi
I'm
was in
glad
there
to hear
too.
that, man, because honestly, like I wholeheartedly agree with Dumbo, Pinocchio, and Snow White being above this one in so many different ways.
I'm
And
just
another one too, like there's some things that irritate me about this story in particular, not to take it out on Snow White in particular, but there's there's that whole catfish scenario, which I think it is a good representation of this movie, but on the back of that catfishing is just this fascination with wealth and aesthetics. Like it's not like anyone's trying to do something for the greater good or overcome some personal, weakness and have this like grand story arc. It's just like, I'm poor. Oh, there's a rich guy. I want to marry that rich guy, so I too am rich and have these nice things in life. And that essentially is how it pans out as well. And it also has this unjustified rags to riches story. And I mean, rags to riches stories are fun ones, especially for kids. But it kind of hammers in that materialist, aesthetic version of rags to riches. And A is that I don't trust real rags to riches stories when you hear them in real life. I always think like, yeah, someone was funding that, like someone was bankrolling that rags to riches story for a reason, and what was their purpose. But the other aspect of it too was that, rags to riches in what? And are we talking clothing here? Are we talking being covered in cinder and ash versus getting to wear ball gowns that if you look at the silhouette, like there's a corset involved, there's a lot of uncomfortable clothing, and like submissiveness implied in that whole rigmarole. So I don't know, it's weird because the rags to riches here is almost like going from freedom into going into some kind of, slavery of modern society of once you become that princess, like guess what? You're wearing a corset for the rest of your life. You're probably wearing those uncomfortable glass slippers the rest of your life. You might be thinking back to simpler times when, man, I wish I all I had to do was dust the tower and wear my nice comfortable flats.
And have that fantastic view from the tower.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, you want the real life version of how this rolls down is that Princess die? That didn't end well on
Yeah,
multiple
yeah,
levels.
they get into a crash in a tunnel followed by paparazzi.
But and I mean that and the what 10 years of preceding scandal, that's how the Cinderella story tends to pan out in the end, especially when they, maybe they'll get lucky and they get along, but there's a pretty high chance they're going to find some major personality problems in between each other.
Well, for all the Hollywood directors that are listening to this podcast and stealing our ideas, the Cinderella rags to riches story, but painting her as an evil gold digger would have a fun spin to it, I think.
Oh, the other spin I'd like to add, all the Prince wants is a beard. He's already got an affair with a coachman. He needs to, find some smoke screen for that.
Yeah, he needs like the romantic fence for that relationship, right? That's the beard.
Yeah, so yeah, make Cinderella a gold digger, and that's the princess role, and there you got a nice modern movie, I guess. Maybe. Let me see if I got any. Oh yeah, we got some proto chipmunks in this. I thought that was fun. I kept expecting
I made
sing.
that note too, man. There
Christmas
was
time is
some
here again.
singing that absolutely reminded me of Alvin and the Chipmunk. I even made a note here that just says Alvin.
I was just listening to a Patton Oswalt comedy album where he's like, "Yeah, we used to slow it down so it sounds like a bunch of bored guys just singing Christmas songs, a monotone, Christmas time, and then like Satan comes and Alvin." You play it at that slow. If you play your 45 at 33 for those with functioning turntables, there was another album, uh, the Super Furry Animals. They put out an album. It looked, it's on large vinyl, but you actually were supposed to play at 45. And I was getting wasted. I think I listened to it 3 times before I realized that. It's like, man, this is a weird album. But yeah,
Yeah, well,
oh,
actually, a lot of the recent releases of high fidelity albums come out on a full size, but it's run at 45 just for the higher fidelity.
yeah, this was I think 2008, so it's probably about when they started doing that. So I got
I think MoFi is pretty big with those.
yeah, I got kind of I now I have a bunch of vinyl but no turntable. So I sent all my
It's
vinyl to Japan,
worth
but didn't.
it's worth investing in, man.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you've got the vinyl ready, because man, the vinyl is what takes up all the freaking room. So
True, true. No, I keep spotting them. I really should take the plunge sometime, but have not done that yet. So, but yeah, I definitely had a few years of wanting to vinyl it. Um, I guess I should ask if you want to just have a quick look over your notes and see what we've missed.
yeah, I've got a couple little mini punchlines. One is that in addition to the prototypal Alvin and the Chipmunks kind of singing, I also really feel that some of these mice look like Slowpoke Gonzalez from Looney Tunes, and I'm not sure which one came before the other, but there is absolutely a likeness between the two. Um, and do you remember Slowpoke Gonzalez at all? Who is Speedy Gonzalez's cousin from Mexico. And he's like kind of like a drunker, fatter, sleepier version of Speedy Gonzalez. But man, he looks so damn close to some of the mice in this movie.
Now that you're mentioning it, I do remember. I was like, wait, what is he? Speedy? He's not Slowpoke, but yeah, now I remember Slowpoke. I feel like Speedy Gonzalez was a little bit later, so this might have actually been
Probably.
first. I feel like Speedy was like a 50s thing, kind of like
They're
the
related.
Twilight.
Anyways, the mice in Cinderella and Slowpoke Gonzalez share some DNA somewhere. I don't know
So,
where it is, but
you're thinking the
uh
fat one, Gus there.
yeah, yeah, and actually another one too almost has the same cadence. I mean, he doesn't have the thick Latin accent like Slowpoke does, but I don't know that I couldn't not see it constantly, so I had to make that note for myself. I had another note here. If the birds can make her bed, why can't they just do all of her chores for her? like towards the end of the very beginning when she's doing that song, and as she leaves the room, the birds pull up the sheets and they fluff the pillow and stuff. And I'm just thinking, like, is that the only thing that they chip in for? Like, it seems like all the other horrible tasks that she's, has to deal with, like, how come those animals aren't doing some cool, like, sword in the stone, magic for her and just doing her job?
Maybe the sisters have some buckshot rifles that they like to
Yeah,
take out on the
yeah,
bird.
they keep taking them out. And also if you notice her sidekicks here are all like undesirable animals. They're rodents and they're, lizards and reptiles and stuff. I'm ignoring the birds here purposefully because they don't make my point. And then
No, they
also
they
the
do.
cat, Lucifer. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I assumed her room smells like bird shit.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah. She has to deal with all the bird shit in the room. But and even if you include the cat, right? So you've got birds, lizards, and rodents that her sidekicks, and then Lucifer is the pet of the mother, and all of her sidekicks are the natural prey of Lucifer the cat. Which just kind of, I think if anything, man, like Lucifer represents evil way more than the stepmother and the sisters do, just by the name and by the actual impending doom of this cat that could kill all of her friends, all of her magical friends that she can talk to. So that one was kind of interesting for me. There's also a really weird sense of scale. So in that same scene where the birds are making her bed, it's like, okay, so if their bed's that big and the bird's about that big, but then it shows them like dipping a sponge into a bowl of water and like drying it out and stuff, just like doing other stuff. And in that part, the birds are like a tenth of the size that they were in the previous scene. And I don't think this was like a magical thing. This was just like a very easy oversight in the art direction. I think, damn it, Thor, this is why you weren't part of the original nine, is overlooking crap like this. But it just looked really weird. It was like, oh, all of a sudden these birds went from like the size of a baseball to like the size of a dime, based on the scale here. So there was a little bit of inconsistency there that kept taking me out of it a little bit. um there's all we get to see a little bit of bare naked skin. Cinderella's changing. We see like her back on her profile, which felt a little bit risque for 1950s and probably inspired all sorts of Rule 34 stuff to follow soon after. So that was a little glimpse. And then let's see what else here. Oh, and there's a part where she goes and they find a mouse in a trap. And is this Gus that they find in the trap? I think it's like the dumb one,
Yeah,
essentially,
yeah.
that they doesn't know anything. Um, and I just remember making a note of like, what kind of trap is that? Because I'm pretty sure in the time period of this, like a mouse trap would not have been a benign thing that's like, oh, the mouse is still like totally healthy. It would have been absolutely mangled. But also, what trap is this legitimately? Like, what was the purpose of setting that particular trap that just catches the mouse and then it leaves you to do something with it? I don't know.
I think it's more like bait. Lucifer's bait, not so much a trap. I mean, that's a trap too, but not. It wasn't a mouse trap as much as bait for a mouse, and then Lucifer comes in for the kill because Cinderella's got to get it above out of his paw, right? So that
And
could
then
be it.
there was a quote in this movie that I like because the context was like it was being serious. And it was Cinderella telling someone else, but they're saying you better get rid of those dreams. Like you need to change your dreams. So in one case, it's like a dream is a wish the heart makes, and there's nothing as pure as a dream,
If you're
and these
Cinderella.
things that you want. If it's something that aligns with what Cinderella wants, but if it's something that Cinderella doesn't want, it's like, oh, you better get rid of those dreams. So I thought that was an interesting sort of hypocrisy that just stuck out like a sore thumb.
Prince is going to learn about that little, bit of cognitive dissonance
Yeah.
6 months down the
Yeah,
line.
once the honeymoon's over, man, let's see how happily ever after they really are, right?
I also liked her non sequitur talking about Gus again, where he's like, "I'm gonna name you Octavius. Your nickname is Gus." Like what? Why don't you just name him Gus?
Yeah, yeah. There was just, yeah, non sequitur is a good way to put it. Like why did that line exist? Why is that named that? Yeah, it was an interesting kind of thing to shoehorn in there.
Oh, the other thing I did want to bring up a little more on I guess a proper angle is I guess the fairy godmother is basically like a daemon. I'm spelling it like the Greek way, like DAE, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, like the Linux kernel service that's running.
Right. But you know, it's in the right night. That's basically the same as a demon, right? Just can be good or bad. So
Yeah, and honestly, the fairy godmother here has like those cool rules of like everything expires at midnight and everything, which really does mean that this is purely an illusion that Cinderella's been putting on, and she realizes that it's all a big facade and she's just putting on this act. Which is kind of like weak magic, right? Like compared to all the other magic that's going on in this movie and previous movies, like I mean, she can talk to birds for all intents and purposes here. What a great headliner of like woman knows how to talk to birds. No one else in this movie implies that they can talk to the animals the same way that she can.
she's old enough that she could join the traveling roadshow and not make a mess of it like Pinocchio, right? She can be a sideshow freak.
So and I've got some notes broken down here into some of the different symbolism. So we'll end on the glass slipper because I have the most notes on that, and I think you even had a note of like I hope there's something symbolic about these damn slippers. There is, and in fact, there's a lot of stuff. I don't know how much gets attributed to the Disney story overall, but there's a lot of cool stuff that we can poke about. There's also some elements of the gown, but I want to start on the pumpkin because the pumpkin was really interesting because there's a really old book called the Dictionary of Symbols. And in the Dictionary of Symbols, it describes a pumpkin as being a link between the upper and the lower worlds. And it also represents the concept of inversion, which regulates all the dichotomies and dualities of the universe, life and death, and sorrow and joy, and rags and riches. And the pumpkin in particular, like outside the context of this movie, is known as this particular item that represents that link between the two worlds. Because it's getting all of its nutrients from underground, but it's growing above ground, so it's got this like inherent link. And what better of a vehicle, a literal vehicle that Cinderella gets into and herself kind of transports into a completely different world. So her entering the pumpkin and the pumpkin transforming into a literal pumpkin and then into this sort of like surreal angelic transportation device that brings you in another world. Just the act of getting in that and going with it on this travel, it transforms the person that's getting into it. In this case, it's kind of Cinderella. And it's really, there's a really cool and deep link here that I wish I had more time to get into, and like all the origins of this pumpkin symbolism. But this pumpkin symbolism predates the story of Cinderella itself. So it's hard to pretend that this link wasn't intentionally added there for some deeper storytelling reason that doesn't come across as easily in the Disney movie, because it just seems like an arbitrary, oh, that pumpkin looks big enough that it could be a carriage, and that's why they picked the pumpkin. But very likely there was a much deeper reason why the pumpkin in particular was picked for this.
It's probably also worth knowing that once everything transforms back, the pumpkin is instantly smashed. Like
Oh
one of
yeah,
the
I guess
horses comes
implying
in.
that you can't return back to that dream world in the same vehicle that you used before.
Granted, it would have been much more horrific if we, like mutilated the horse or the mice. So we don't want to see them get smashed. So I guess that's why it was the pumpkin. But yeah, but yeah, like you
and
said, that dream's
and the
over.
the
Back.
horse was a good note here because I didn't take this note down, but I've always thought this, that like the horse before the transformation and after the transformation, he goes from like a goofy looking animal into like this handsome carriage driver or something. But like why would a horse turn into the human? I don't know, it was just this very weird sort of mechanic to it, because also the horse was like her friend essentially in like normal world.
Yeah, why can't the horse be a horse? You need a horse. Why are the mice horse? It's weird. Yeah.
Well,
I
and not just
guess
that, but the horse goes from being like a friend that she talks to and like and hangs out with, to like the guy, like, don't look at the driver. He becomes like the limo driver. That's a very impersonal relationship all of a sudden, and I just thought that was interesting.
I guess kind of maybe he's kind of an NPC as a person, not
Yeah,
enough
yeah,
sentience to really work it out that way or something like that.
yeah. Even though the horse technically is probably the smartest animal she interacts with, all the other animals are like more leading of sidekicks.
One bit of I don't know if there's anything to this or not, but the wallpaper inside the house, I kind of like assumed it would be like all fleur de lis, and you do see one or two fleur de lis, but the actual wallpaper is kind of like this weird like multi corkscrew like bottle opener looking thing. Do you know the design I'm talking about?
I didn't notice that. Now I'll have to rewatch that and look for it.
Okay, but yeah, I like because the fleur de lis has a lot of symbolism and stuff behind it, and they didn't go with that. They went with a different image, so I thought that was kind of interesting. And
Especially since this is based on the French version of the tale, so the fleur de lis would have made sense in this context.
so that was the thing. I was like, I don't have an answer, but I was like, well, why did they choose this other design then? And there is something like I think the stepmother is like standing at like a post on the stairwell, and it does have a fleur de lis. So I did use them, but yeah, there's just this other design. Also, because I was watching the Disney View thing, which has like pads out the sides of the screen. So a lot of time it was using that image on the sides of the screen
Oh yeah, so it
to
was probably
fill it.
standing out a little bit more.
That's exactly. But going back on your trip, man, we mentioned the pumpkin. What was next? Something between that and the slipper, I suppose.
The gown. So the gown is another example of just classism, and we mentioned before how Cinderella is essentially like a fashion model. Like she's just the like this really nice looking coat hanger that you put the dress and you put the stuff on, and everyone admires the stuff, and they're not admiring the coat hanger. And again, to like reconfirm this, the prince doesn't even know what she looks like. Just by looking at her face or talking to her or anything, all he knows is what the gown looks like and if the slipper fits or not. And again, this gown plays into this, and I found too in one of the older versions of this gown, in the movie it's kind of made out of almost like glass, like it matches the rest of her outfit, so there's almost like this blue transparent sheen to it in the cartoon that makes it look like the gown has some kind of glass element, but it also is essentially made out of like gold and silver from certain aspects. In the older stories, they share that it's usually made out of pearls and gold and silver and like jewels encrusted in it. But there's also some versions where it's satin, and the satin has some of the symbolism that the cartoon doesn't necessarily portray, and that's this two-sidedness that also just the story of Cinderella herself kind of tells, where she presents herself to be this like shiny, flashy, like really impressive person that just stands out. Everyone's like, oh, where did this princess come from? But in reality, it's this like more mundane rags, servant type of girl. And again, this represents that aspect of satin that, depending on what angle you look at it, it can look nice and shiny, or it can kind of look a little bit matte and dull. So I thought that was kind of a cool symbolism that exists in the story itself and not necessarily the cartoon.
So it makes me think of a John Waters book, Role Models, where he's talking about a fashion designer he really likes because it'll look like a nice normal sporty jacket, but like one button's the wrong color, or like it looks great from the outside, but the inside's like lined with like rat fur. So I mean, maybe that's what her gown's like. It's nice on the outside, has some rat fur on the inside because they had to get the
it's
fur
it's
from
just lined
somewhere.
with rags and rat fur. Yeah, I like that. But yeah, the gown here just kind of reconfirms some of the superficial element of this, and then that leads into the most symbolic of all, and the thing that essentially defines the story of Cinderella, which are the glass slippers.
Okay, on with the slippers then.
So what did you have? Because you had some fun kind of like ranty notes on it, which led you into like, hey, I hope there's more to this. So I'll get to the more to it, but I want to hear some of your kind of observations.
Oh, let's see. So the moral of the movie is that large-footed women suck. Okay, we could get that. But yeah, I do find it just fun how they show such a ridiculous, like, their feet are like never going into that slipper. Once we see one shatter, I'm definitely like, this seems like a dangerous thing to wear. You mentioned like, oh, maybe it should be like crystal. I'm like, that makes a little more sense. But either way, you're wearing some pretty uncomfortable shoes. You're gonna end up with some like notable blisters the next day. So maybe it's the impracticality of it which really sticks out. Like there's just like no reason you would wear these. Like it was in the 80s or whatever, girls would wear those jelly shoes. So they kind of look like glass slippers in the end, but they were plastic. So
And they're probably way more comfortable.
and way more comfortable. Yeah, just the idea like walking around dancing in these is just yeah, and how she loses a shoe and doesn't notice till she gets home. That's also kind of weird. You think you'd notice if you lost a shoe.
She's probably relieved. She's like, "Oh wow, why does one of my feet just feel so much more comfortable than the other one? I'll figure it out later."
The other one has like needle pricks of glass into her foot. So that's where I'm like, man, I hope there's some decent symbolism here because
So
practically there's
there is
nothing going.
there is some actual symbolism, whether whether it was implied in the movie itself or not. But I think in the story, all this is kind of implied in some subtle ways. So the slipper we can kind of break down into three main components, or sort of like ways of representing it. One is that it's made out of glass, or we'll say crystal, whatever it is. It is both fragile perhaps, and in being fragile, dangerous. Like what if you did smash it while you were wearing it? I mean, there goes your Achilles tendon, right? Like you're just never gonna walk again because you had to look fancy at the ball. So there's this element of danger and risk and fragility all combined into one, which that's kind of sexy, right? It's like the danger and the allure of this thing. Then there's the transparent element of it, which kind of represents not just the purity of Cinderella and kind of representing her as this, pure spirit, but also which is cool. We'll get into in a second too, is that transparency represents kind of like truth, like the ultimate truth. Like you can't lie about this slipper, not just because it's transparent, but because also they have to put their feet into it, which again, it's like you can't lie about this slipper. Like either you fit into it or you don't. And then again, the slipper itself, just as the aesthetic and the shape and the form, that kind of represents the elegance and the beauty, because it's not just like it's not a clog, right? And it's not a croc. It's like a freaking nice looking kind of like a high heeled shoe to it. So not only does it imply this elegance and beauty, but it also implies, man, whoever's putting this thing on is willing to submit themselves to uncomfort and pain, and just a general sense of submissiveness for you to even put this thing on, let alone dance in it for hours. So all of these elements of it sort of imply, purity and truth and justice and danger and fragility, but also this like fitting into norms and this allure into the wealth. And then one of the other things that didn't make it into the cartoon from the book, which is really interesting, is that when the prince actually starts going around and having the stepsisters wear this, again in the books, they look just as beautiful as Cinderella does. So if you had all three in a lineup, you wouldn't necessarily pick Cinderella over the other two. In the movie, you might have, because they intentionally draw them a little bit goofier. So in the book, the only thing that really can tell them apart is whether or not their feet fit into this shoe. And in the book, one of the sisters, I think, cuts her big toe off so that it can fit in, and the other one starts slicing chunks of her heel off so that her foot can fit in. But even as they try and they mutilate themselves and they maim their feet to get it to fit into this particular shape, it still is obvious that it's not like a perfect fit. And this is just all going to show of like, look at what these women were willing to do, like just maim and mutilate themselves just to fit into this mold so that they can, be this gold digger of like achieving wealth and riches through marriage. Again, like none of this is being done for any kind of like ultimate greater good. It's just like, let's get out of here. And to point out too that the stepmother and the stepsisters are not necessarily poor and destitute. The treatment that they give Cinderella is entirely imposed upon her, so they don't necessarily need to be like raised out of abject poverty the same way that Cinderella needs to be. So it's like they just want to go from being higher upper class to like upper class with the prince. Whereas Cinderella, it actually represents this transformation from the very bottom to the very top, essentially. Um,
They do
and then
mention in the opening narration, though, that this house is in decline, basically. Like it still has, I guess, a fair amount of upscale to it, but Yeah, they said since the father has died, this the basically thing has been going
They could
downhill.
downsize and be pretty well off, you know what I mean, if they
Yeah,
just
yeah,
like
true.
change their spending habits. Like the disparity between how Cinderella is treated in the clothes that she wears versus the clothes that her stepsisters wear, and the fact that they're even part of society where the prince would come to their house and knock on the door. Like they're not living in, in like piss buckets or anything. And I had a final note here, which was just this glass slipper thing. I couldn't get a comparison of like OJ putting on the glove. Like if the glove doesn't fit, you must have quit. Kind of sense to this, where it's like, what if Cinderella, like, what if her feet were just bloated that day? She just had like extra water weight in her feet. Since the prince obviously can't tell her between her personality and her face, just the dress and the slipper, like, would she just been screwed, if she was like a little bit bloated that day or what?
Yeah, and I mean, a shoe's probably going to fit more than one woman. I mean, we do have shoe stores, that sell standard, sizes. So he might have.
So if you discount the fact that it could potentially fit more than one person, the slipper itself does represent justice and absolute truth. This is like the judge and the jury. Like you can't lie to this slipper because it's transparent, it's clear, it's pure, but also the form of it is what makes everything just. So even if the sisters lied and they try to cut their toe off and the heel off and did everything they could to portray themselves as something they're not, they can't lie to that slipper. Although again, like there's a little bit of contradiction here, because like who's lying the most, like a sister cutting off a toe so it can fit into a slipper, or Cinderella saying that's my slipper, oh but by the way, like the horse wasn't real, the gown wasn't real, like where did the slippers even come from? Like that's all magic, none of that even actually exists, it's all just like a figment of imagination at some element.
And my feet smell like cured rat meat. That I ruin a lot of my movies just by thinking about what it would smell like in any given scene. So
Yeah, what would that glass zipper smell like after dancing for a few hours and just like there's nowhere for the sweat to go out to, right? It just kind of pools up.
and I'm thinking even the fancy ball, it might have like manure from the streets wafting in, so it is
Yeah, I don't I
still
don't
100
think
years ago.
I don't think like universal plumbing was introduced in the time period of this. So you're not wrong, man. There was probably all sorts of fecal matter on those glass slippers.
Yeah, that's a good ending for the movie. I guess we'll get ready to wrap up, but did you have any other big points for this one?
Just my leading one, man. This could have been an episode of The Con that you just watched at, prime time over dinner, about someone catfishing a rich CEO. It just happens to take place in a more fairy tale sort of scenario, but man, this is the ultimate catfish story.
And you can't really get behind Cinderella because there's barely anyone there. So I would say that's the biggest flaw here. Like you mentioned, the animation's maybe a little more streamlined. Once we get to 101 Dalmatians, it's going to be a lot more streamlined. But still get as far as the animation, I think we're still getting pretty close to top dollar here. But yeah, the pacing of the movie's good. It's just the characterizations are just like weird or lacking.
And there's also never a sense of danger or threat or death. Like Pinocchio had Pleasure Island and the whale, and so many scenes where it feels like you as a viewer or the protagonist are gonna die, and there's nothing that even come, even in Snow White, there's the poison apple, and there's all sorts of scary scenes of like witches and and creatures being conjured. But in this one, it just lacks it. Like the worst thing that happens is that her mom is really really mean to her and makes her do some really boring chores, and that's kind of the limit of it, you know what I mean? Like it almost feels like there would be more invested in here if we saw, if you actually saw the stepsister cutting her toe off to make sure that Cinderella can't get this dream that she wants. Like that, even that little extra kind of morbid detail would kind of be like, oh man, she's really living in this toxic sort of environment. But, from the outside in looking at it, it's like, man, she's got a great view. She can talk to animals. And I know that, like, it makes it sound like her job's really bad, but like the worst thing that she did was had birds make her bed. You know what I mean? Like there's not a lot, and like she sweeps the floor and stuff. It doesn't seem all that bad in comparison to, like my mom getting shot in front of me and the forest being set on fire.
Yeah, I think part of us doing the series of podcasts is that we're not trying to say no, these aren't just like kids films. But now I'm going to phrase this by saying every good kids film needs something to scar you. There's
And this
nothing.
one's missing that. It is. It's missing one element that it could have been a little bit more adult or scary or just high stakes, I guess. Like there's nothing at all in this movie that raises the stakes other than maybe she doesn't get to catfish the guy that she was trying to catfish.
Yeah. Also, by the way, her being like, "Oh, I have the other slipper," seems like way more of a I don't know, that just seems to carry a lot more weight than my foot fits in the slipper. Like I have the other one, you know. Although how they know the other one's broken, they can't compare anymore. I guess I got good photographic memory. The Duke has a photographic memory. That must be it. Okay, I guess we'll wrap this one up for today. So, what are you up to? You got any comics pumping out soon?
Yeah, so recently we finished up the Chosen One Kickstarter, which was successful. And I don't know if you I don't think many people know this, but as a publisher, there is a worldwide paper shortage, which sounds silly, but it is absolutely true. I guess they're using all of those byproducts for making toilet paper to avoid the next big toilet paper shortage, but there is now a paper shortage, which makes printing comics and other stuff take a little bit longer, a little bit more expensive. So anyways, I just got word back that we're getting the large print run for the Chosen One finished up, and I should have that in the next week or two. And we're currently in production on the Chosen One issue 2, and we're gonna soon be starting up on issue 3. So that's a pretty big focus. And then also I've got a game that probably won't even be out by the time someone hears this, but it's called Lucifer Lives in Lower Manhattan, and it takes place in the 1940s, and it's kind of like a visual novel game that you should definitely look out for soon. So that's what's been on my plate so far. And other than that, you can check me on paranoidamerican.com and at paranoidamerican on Instagram, and just kind of follow all the various cool stuff I've been working on, comics and coloring books and games, everything that has to do with conspiracy theories, American culture, and what I consider occult research.
This is not the cat Lucifer, though. Not the cat in your comic.
Not No, it's not about the
Not the
cat.
cat.
It's about the actual Luciferians that we were talking about a little bit earlier.
As for this one, well, I guess we're doing Occult Disney, but this I talk about sci-fi films, The Twilight Zone. There's some stuff on games. If you go to Patreon for a bit of support, they will find that at Podcastius, where you can support this along with other podcasts. Okay, the midnight bell's about to strike, so I guess I'm gonna go on my train to work. That
Yep,
doesn't
go
make
find your
sense.
pumpkin.
Yeah, I'm gonna work in Pumpkin.